So what do you need to know in order to really fully comprehend what economic growth is and how it can be applied, and for that matter, how it's applied in the AP macro exam? What do you need to know? Let's go back to those learning objectives. We're going to cover A and B here in this section, and then when we get to the guided practice portion, we're going to practice a little bit of the calculations of per capita GDP and economic growth. But first, let's talk about measuring economic growth and the determinants of economic growth. What is economic growth by definition, and what determines economic growth? Well, how do we define and measure it first? We define economic growth as increases in real GDP per capita over time. Okay, that's both the definition and the measurement of economic growth. We're going to look at that figure shortly. But again, consider what that means. Anytime you see per capita in any context, you think of it as per person. You're dividing some variable, in this case, real GDP, by the overall population. So in a very literal sense, we're taking real GDP and we're saying, okay, if we divided that GDP, real GDP, evenly among the population, which of course does not happen, but if we did, what would that come out to? That's real GDP per capita. That is, in this measurement, a measure of productivity, a measure of output per worker, which is what we have come to use as a measure of economic growth. So make that connection. Just as important is that you know what is not considered economic growth. As I said, we're making a distinction here. We're talking long run. When we say economic growth, that inherently means long-term, long-run economic growth. It doesn't reference short-run increases in output. So picture ADAS again. We know that if aggregate demand shifts to the right, output's going to increase. That's a short-run increase in output. That is not what we consider long-term economic growth. The same is true if the short-run aggregate supply were to shift to the right in and of itself. Sure, output's increasing, but that's a short-run increase in output. That's not that long-term increase. It does not indicate that we've had any increase in capital formation. It doesn't indicate an increase in GDP per capita. It does not imply any changes in productivity. It simply means that for the time being, we've had an increase in output. Full employment output in this situation has not changed, and that's what we need to see for there to be economic growth. Finally, what are the determinants of economic growth? This is going to start sounding repetitive, but we've already mentioned them. The determinants of economic growth: changes in technology, changes in capital stock, which we call capital formation. Why is that? Well, here I want you to think about it. This is going to help you understand. We measure economic growth as increases in essentially output per worker. I know it's not that simple, but it's a good way to look at it. Well, if you break it down to the micro level, the individual firm, the individual worker level, how do you increase output for every individual worker? The simplest way, the simplest explanation: give them better tools to use. And how do you give them better tools to use? Improve the technology, improve the machines that they have, the physical capital, help them with training, help them with education, help develop new human capital. That's how you get economic growth. That's how you get gains in productivity. That term capital formation summarizes the gains in capital stock, the development of capital stock that we're talking about here. That's what I was talking about with the exam question that we discussed at the beginning of the lesson. So that's going to be a common explanation when we want to make a linkage between changes in investment spending and changes in long-run aggregate supply, changes in the economic growth rate. It's the capital formation that drives it, and capital formation comes from investment spending. Make sure we've made that connection and that we're capable of making that connection when we're describing the reasons for economic growth. So those are the determinants and the measures of economic growth. The next question then becomes, how do we know that? How do we know this relationship be true? What illustrates that for us? What explains that for us? And what does it is something we call an aggregate production function. So I'm going to introduce this to you and talk just a little bit about it and how it can be illustrated both in a mathematical equation and as a model. This is it, as you can see in two different ways. The aggregate production function is what really captures that relationship between GDP per capita, real GDP per capita, and those inputs that go into determining changes in real GDP per capita, which also means changes in economic growth. On the top in blue here, we have an equation. Real GDP per capita is equal to T, which stands for technology, times physical capital per worker, times human capital per worker. treat that like any equation. Obviously, what's on one side has to be equal to what's on the left. So if what's on one side goes up, the other side has to go up as well. So what this is saying by bringing these all together into one equation is that, for example, if technology T were to rise, if there's an improvement in technology, which is on one side of the equation, well, then it has to be met by increases in real GDP per capita on the other side of the equation. The other two variables are true as well. If there's an increase in physical capital per worker, again, new machinery, better equipment to work with, that's going to increase output per worker, GDP per capita. If you have better education, better training, or even learning by doing over time, the gaining of experience, you're going to see development of human capital, which is also going to lead to increases in real GDP per capita. Again, means the same thing as economic growth. Visually, we can see this on the aggregate production function that we have at the bottom here, where output per worker is on the y-axis, capital per worker on the x, and productivity is in this somewhat upward sloping at a diminishing rate trend. And what, again, it's saying is as we add more and more capital per worker, we will tend to see increases in productivity, increases in output per worker. That, again, equates to economic growth. Okay. So that's the aggregate production function. This is where we find that relationship and evidence of that relationship between all of these different variables. And that's something we can refer back to whenever we have a question about those. Moving forward from there, how does this look in the format of a question? Well, here's an old multiple choice question. Again, this is one of the ones that is freely available on AP Classroom. An increase in which of the following is most likely to increase the long-run growth rate of an economy's real per capita income? All right, first things first, let's look at reading this question. You may have to translate some things because concepts are not always communicated in the exact same way. This one's a little bit wordy. We're looking for an increase in the long-run growth rate of an economy's real per capita income. Now, I haven't used that phrase yet, but you should know that it means the same thing as real GDP per capita. Real income, real GDP, same thing. So what's going to cause an increase in real per capita income? If we refer back here, we should be looking for one of these three things: an increase in the level of technology, an increase in the level of physical capital, an increase in the level of human capital. So I've got to scan through my answer options and try to find them. A, population growth? No, that's not one. Proportion of GDP consumed? No, that's not one. Educational attainment? Let's think about that one, but we'll come back to it. Supply of money? No. Personal income taxes? No. Well, it wasn't straightforward stated, but look at C a little more closely. The educational attainment of the population. What exactly is that saying? If there's an increase, go back to your question, if there's an increase in the educational attainment of the population, what's going to happen as a result of that? Well, we'd like to assume that with more attainment of education, with greater degrees of educational attainment, we're going to see development of human capital. Go back over here to your production function. If human capital were to rise, that's going to lead to an increase in real GDP per capita. C's got to be your correct answer. So again, this is just one way that we can use the aggregate production function in the context of AP Macro and the way questions are going to be asked in AP Macro. All right.